Thank you for coming today. I think this is going to be a really exciting hour and a half of a presentation and discussion. So I want to introduce our two speakers, Chuck Humphrey from Portage, and not Duggan O'Neill, Steve Cundy from UBC. Dugan got sick, and so Steve has graciously agreed to step in and impersonate Dugan. So let me tell you a little bit about our speakers and then just turn it over to them. One of the things I wanted to say is that we want this to be an interactive session, so we're not going to hold questions to the end. If you have questions, ask them as we go along, as they go along. And for people on the webcast, I believe there is a note up that you have an email address in which you can send questions to, and I will try to remember to monitor that. So I'm Lee Starr. I am with the UBC Library. I'm the Associate University Librarian for Research, and research data management is one of the things I care passionately about. Steve Cundy is the Associate Director of Advanced Research Computing here at UBC. It's a project that's slowly gaining steam. Steve has over 17 years supporting research computing through IT. And as I said, he stepped in for Dugan. Thank you so much. Chuck is he's the Executive Director with Portage Canada. I've known Chuck for a lot of years. Chuck was the data management person at the University of Alberta, and I learned a lot from him even then, and I continue to learn from him. One of the things I want to note about Chuck is how involved he's been in getting things to happen nationally for research data management. Back in 2010, 2011, he was part of the group that pulled together a proposal, an idea that went forward to CFI around research data management. It was a proposal ahead of its time. The roots of that concept are still there. And then he was also active in the ARL, E-Sciences Institutes, which were run across Canada and US. And one of the things that he did nationally around managing data in collaboration with some other universities, pulled together data from the polar year. I want to give a little anecdote that I think talks about Chuck as being a visionary. When I was a young librarian and my son had just been born and I came back to work from maternity leave, Chuck was teaching us about how to do a lot of things on the computer, how to FTP and how to Gopher. Some of you probably don't know what those things are, and others of you it'll be all too familiar. But one of the classes Chuck came back in and said one morning, "I've seen the future, and it's amazing." And he'd just seen Mosaic, and he got everyone excited. I continue to be excited by the work he does. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you, Lee. I'm really pleased to be at UBC as I have a long positive relationship working with individuals supporting research data at this institution. Back in the early 80s when I started a data library at the University of Alberta, my first contact was Lina Roos at the University of British Columbia. And she had this joint appointment between the Academic Computing Center and the library. She came from the library, and there was a programmer who came from a computing center. That was relatively unique, not only in Canada, but North America, this collaboration, the support between two institutions that were essential to deal with digital research data. And so there's always been exciting innovations around research data coming out of this institution. My current position as director of Portage Network is to take ideas that stem from institutions like UBC and try to make that available across Canada. So it's an ambitious project, and what I will spend my part of the presentation today describing what our plans are around making research data infrastructure available to researchers across the country. Now, I'm really pleased at Steve's willingness to step up at the last moment. Dugan and I have worked on a slide deck And it was almost an opportunity for us to demonstrate how well the library is cooperating and working with with Compute Canada, with our advanced research computing services. And so we had worked this out that, yeah, we would share slides and we could talk to each other's points. And Steve said, yeah, I can do that. So thank you. Thank you very much for stepping in to do that with us. What I'd like to do is give this introduction to both of our organizations. But I think Steve can even personalize a little bit more about ARC at UBC. I welcome that. He spoke with a couple of us this morning and found very informative as to how the activities of ARC in terms of providing the technology infrastructure is so crucial for that interface with research data infrastructure. And so I mentioned this as research data management infrastructure, and it's not necessarily the same infrastructure as we talk about when we talk strictly about, say, the high-speed research network or the high-performance computing. By research data management infrastructure, I'm talking about the configuration of technology, expertise, and services that we organize around research data across the life cycle, whether that's supported locally or globally. So you can see that it certainly it's dependent on the network services, it's dependent on high-performance computing and computing on resources, but it also has its own characteristics. Then we'll walk you through some of the problems that we're trying to solve. I mean, research data management has now with the notoriety around big data has been identified as a problem. I want to talk about problems more in the context of just managing research data. And then get into how we're addressing research data management problems together. And then we'll look at services and end with some work that we're doing jointly around the preservation pipeline, as we call it, together. Okay, so how about you just give us a few comments about advanced research computing?
Sure. Well, in the national context, excuse me, in the national context, Compute Canada is the pan-Canadian provider, so it's the national provider for advanced research computing. It's the digital infrastructure that allows for things like big data, data science, high-performing computing. It's distributed across the country through 4 regional consortia in Western Canada. That consortia is called WestGrid, and it's made up of member institutions such as UBC. We also have SFU, UVic, Calgary, Alberta, all the way out to Manitoba. UBC ARC is the local group that is here to help enable access to this digital infrastructure, this advanced research computing infrastructure, as well as the capacity to help support use of that infrastructure. So the UBC ARC team is really the local Compute Canada resource to help bridge that gap that exists between the researchers' needs and the technology to help enable those needs. UBC ARC also works very closely with a number of different providers, same as Compute Canada is made up of member consortia. UBC ARC is well connected to the UBC community and hopefully will be even better connected in the future. We work with the research institutes that a number of our faculty are part of, with Vancouver Coastal Health Research Institute, Children's and Families Research Institute, Providence Healthcare, BC Cancer, and so on. The UBC ARC team also works with other IT providers at UBC, so a big part of our focus is enabling access to all sorts of different technologies, not just ARC technology, but working with UBC IT, Faculty of Medicine, Med-IT, Faculty of Science, Arts, and the list goes on. So from an institutional perspective, UBC ARC is really the local Compute Canada team to help enable access to this national infrastructure. And across Canada, I think Dugan will probably mention, yes, there's a collection of 200 experts distributed across the country with a wide range of expertise. So it's not just the experts that you have here on campus, but it is a national network of experts to pair alongside of the technology.
Well, why don't you just mention the configuration of the team that you had? There's
yes.
a very, very insightful grouping of skills that you've brought together.
So one of the things that we've been looking at here at UBC is how can we enable access to this technology and what sort of resources are required. So the UBC ARC team is really led by the VP Research Office, headed up by Helen Burt, who's our AVP Research here. And then to help enable that strategic direction, we have the Chief Information Officer, Jennifer Burns. Jennifer, hello. Who is really leading the technology resources on the campus. Now, the team itself is comprised of an ARC advisor. So in the context of Compute Canada, Dugan O'Neill is the Chief Science Officer. Here at UBC, we have Dr. Corey Nislow from Pharmaceutical Sciences. For the technology delivery and services side, there's myself, and we help support the teams that we have within UBC ARC, which is a Research Systems Management team. So this team is comprised of a bunch of experts that have experience managing HPC infrastructure, storage infrastructure, the high performance network. And then we also have a research data management team. And this research data management team is made up of a number of different scientific analysts. We have a digital humanities scientific analyst, we have life sciences analysts, we have a privacy and security officer that's starting on Monday. The research data librarian for UBC, Eugene Barsky, is also part of the ARC team and helps advise and guide and support the development with research data management work, et cetera. So these two streams of work we think will pair really well with the work that researchers need to provide access to this technology, provide the most effective use of this technology. So please, if you have any more questions about that, we can talk later.
Thanks, Steve. What's so important from my perspective about this team is that it brings together the expertise from across fields, across services. And it's also what we're trying to do nationally by bringing in together expertise. When I started discovering the number of stakeholders that exist around research data management, it's a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of people with the thumb in the pie when it comes to research data management. And so having a team that brings together a lot of those stakeholders or representatives from those stakeholders communities is very important. And it's something that, again, that we're trying to work with at a national level. So I work for CARL, the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, and this is the leadership organization for research libraries in Canada. There are 29 institutions that belong. In BC, it's UBC, Simon Fraser, and UVic. And we have two federal institutions that are also hold memberships. NRCs, to me, they'll always be SISTI. They're now knowledge something. So they were our national science library, let me put it that way. And then also Libraries Archives Canada is the other member. These are the activities around which CARL is engaged. I just wanted to mention that one of the activities that is particularly important to me right now is this aspect of working with other stakeholders as a voice for policy formation. Let me give you an example. In August, there was a consultation by Industry Canada around digital infrastructure. And institutions were invited to, and stakeholders were invited to comment on digital infrastructure in Canada, the needs. And CARL worked with Compute Canada, Canary, Research Data Canada, the Leadership Council for Digital Initiatives, coordinating a common voice. They all said, this is your area, we'll mention you and what you stand for, you mention us and what we stand for. And we were able to present to Industry Canada this fabric that's required to really address digital infrastructure. It's not just one community, it's across communities. And I think that's really significant for us. UBC is a member of CARL, also has a voice for advocating this national perspective on research data management. UBC also has its own voice to make the advocacy, so you get two voices in this, if not more, because you also have Compute Canada relationships, you have relationships with Canary and Research Data Canada. there are two mandates that we're beginning with in Portage. Portage has only existed since the end of 2014. I've only been in my position since September 8th, 2015. So I'm relatively new at this. I was at a meeting where of ocean researchers, and a person introduced himself. He said, well, I'm relatively new in my job. I said, well, how long? He said, 2 years. I said, 2 years? I've been in my job 2 months. He says, well, I guess you are new. I'll always be newer than him in my job. There are two areas where we have our initial mandates. One is this library-based network of expertise, and it reflects again the talent that's being brought together at UBC to address this. We're working within the library community to bring expertise together around stages of the research life cycle, and I'll mention that in a later slide, what that is. But we're also working to support national platforms for planning and preserving and discovering research data. We'll talk a bit more about that too. So what are these problems that we're trying to solve? There isn't just one problem. There's a mix of problems, and it depends upon which community you're talking about as to whether it's a significant problem or not. But I've kind of compiled the ones that I've encountered, both in the literature with international colleagues as well as voices in Canada. One of the problems is this neglect of valuable digital assets. This is a benign neglect. It's not that people aren't aware that digital content is fragile, but it's a question about, well, what do we do with all this? And so the easiest thing is not to do anything. And I'm afraid that's how the picture has been in Canada for the longest time. So one of the problems is, how do you move from neglect to action? And that's partially what Portage is about. And it's partially about the partnerships that we're developing with Compute Canada and other stakeholders to address. For us, it's really about the stewardship of data. In fact, our tagline for our logo is shared stewardship of research data. And this is that commitment for that long-term support for research data. We're also getting this viewed as a problem, research data as a problem, from our funding agencies. And it stems from an OECD set of principles that were published around providing access to publicly funded research data in 2004. Canada was a signatory to that declaration, those set of principles, but we really didn't take any action to back it up. Our funding agencies are now looking at this in terms of a greater return on investment of public spending in the creation of data. So the problem has been that there hasn't been this institutional infrastructure really in place to support the wide sharing of research data. And there's a statement that I've included that is from a tri-agency working group on research data management. It's a statement from the principles on digital data management. And I think it expresses exactly what their concerns are about what the problem is from their perspective around the use of public funds and getting the fullest extent possible a return on this, and the reuse of the data by others. Just in a conference last week in Amsterdam, the International Digital Curation Conference, the big theme in that conference was data reuse. From that perspective of those who had gathered, it was that the problem isn't just making sure it exists or that we're saving it, it's that we actually do something with it when we've saved it. And there were many examples in research where data are being reused or repurposed in new ways of creating knowledge. Do you want to add anything to either of those?
No, I think just the second piece. We've definitely seen from the research community a great deal of interest. I don't think there's a researcher around that would say no to more data. But more specifically, Chuck was mentioning, it's not just the fact that they want to be able to discover this data or get access to this data, but it's also the use of that data. And I think, again, that's where part of that research data management life cycle and having that national framework come together to not only make this data discoverable and accessible, but to make it usable as well. Because that will really be the next generation of discovery when you start talking about big data and data science. This is linking massive amounts of data sets for new discovery and new purposes.
Thanks, Steve. When Lee told the story about me coming and saying, I've seen the future, it's Mosaic. Well, I saw the future last week, and it's new layers of analytic capabilities to existing data collections. And the example, a couple of examples that arose in the conference, one that I'll share with you is from a researcher in health informatics in Germany. And his area of specialization is looking at genes and their correlation to certain diseases. And so what he needs to do is find from all the literature the findings where a gene has been identified and a particular disease or diseases are identified in correlation to it. And so he had this visualization, which was just a spray. It looked more like a peacock's feathers, just sprayed all over. He said, it's a ridiculograph. So like, this is a ridiculous amount of information I'm showing you at one time. But there were points that were important for him to identify because the points were particular genes. And he could take a gene and then he could drill down in that. And he could say, well, why isn't this gene correlated with this set of diseases? Is it because no one's done that investigation, or is this gene not related to? So it's given him then an opportunity to go back into the lab and start doing more work on this. So it's a method that he's coming out. So we're getting new methodology to evolve out of data-intensive research, which brings me to that next problem, which is how do we conduct data-intensive research? Well, you need to have curated data collections, and it's really difficult to combine data or reuse data without well-curated data. And his point is that the metadata was critical for him to be able to look at across the literature to assemble that initial compilation of aggregate results so that he could then start looking at this in more detail. Another area of problem, and this is one that is shared by the library community in particular, and that is this enhancement of scholarly communication. In fact, when Carl began its research data management working group, that group was associated with scholarly communications. We're seeing increasingly this connection between publication and data. And if you've been following the news, almost daily, the last month, we've been seeing retractions of articles because the findings couldn't be replicated, either because they couldn't find the data or it couldn't be replicated from the data that they were given. So this is this desire to have a more complete picture of what a scholarly publication is, its data, and its also the findings, but it's also the code. And I think this is part of what we're looking at is in order to do successful replication, it's not just the data, it's how the data were actually analyzed, and the code represent that. Do you want to add anything?
No, I think you nailed it there. It's one of our Associate Deans of Research here within Faculty of Science, Gail Murphy, a number of years ago, top of the list was reproducibility and reuse. And as she described it to me, there was that natural pairing between the research data management work and the technology side. So really being able to package up that snapshot in time of the code, the version of the code, the operating system, everything. So not only can you get the original data set and try to do it, but you have the same environment to reproduce those results.
And the last point I'm bringing up here is operationally, introducing workflow practices that increasingly automate as much as possible the flow of data through research. It is the case that increasingly there's so much data that there's going to be even less opportunity for hands-on work to deal with the volume of data that we're engaged in. We need increasingly better machine-to-machine interactions to support our research data, not just from the standpoint of research data management, but actually from the standpoint of analysis too. One of the researchers at last week's conference said, text is for humans, digital data is for computers. That's where the communication should be occurring. And so we're looking increasingly at workflow practices, and that's part of the relationship that we have with Compute Canada, is developing a platform that will take different systems and create better workflows to manage the data, to use the data. So working together to solve these problems together. Carl and Compute Canada came together at a post-digital infrastructure summit held in Ottawa in January 2014. And it gave us an opportunity to work together where we never had before. And as we did that, we discovered that we had very important complementary roles. And I think Steve has already alluded to this, the talent that he's bringing together, they bring different skills and different insights to the problem. And that's what we found with Compute Canada and Carl working together. This is a timeline, and what I'm going to do is kind of paint for you a picture of how these working relationships have come together. Let me start by saying that UBC has been a regional player in research data management for many years. And recently, as 2.5, 3 years ago, UBC, in partnership with SFU and the University of Alberta, undertook this joint initiative to do enhancements to a preservation system called Archivematica. And it was that collaboration. Out of that, we were saying, well, once we have this tool, we can work better together. We can actually do things regionally to support this enterprise even wider. Why do we want to do this wider? It's because, A, researchers tend to work in teams. Those teams tend to be interinstitutionally based, even internationally based. So we have to be able to think about our local, but in the context of the global. So when we do things here, we also want to be able to share them nationally as well as internationally. And so this is an initiative that allowed us to see that, yes, these three institutions not only worked well together, they can accomplish things together and provide that kind of platform base for moving this forward. And I think those are important messages for all of you at the UBC campus, is that your library has been engaged already in productive ways, working with other institutions to improve research data management. So another way in which UBC has been involved was with the Carl proposal. RDMI stands for Research Data Management Infrastructure. This was an initiative that was begun in 2010. It was an anticipation of the CFI funding package that was to be announced in 2011. We took a gamble. We thought that CFI might have a national platform envelope. In the end, it turned out to be LEF or the leadership envelopes that were vertically rather than horizontally. And Carl withdrew its application from CFI. But what we came out of that exercise was a working model around research data management infrastructure that is relevant today. It's the same model that we're using with Importage to the implementation. The big difference is that with CFI funding, we were going to do it from the top down. What we're doing today is building it from the bottom up. And that's, I'll share a bit more from that. So that's the takeaway from the Carl proposal. I don't know if you have anything to say about the Carl proposal?
Well, I only want to add that I think the Carl proposal itself, so when I first came to the Vancouver campus and was looking at research, one of the early introductions I had with the library was with Lee, and she had gone into great detail about this proposal and the work that was being done, and was really the exposure to, you know, the potential that research data management had. And in fact, it helped form a lot of the workflows and processes and analysis that today make up the advanced research computing consultation, walking through the data lifecycle to determine the needs and the technology to support those needs. So it's quite informative.
Yeah, great. I'm glad I turned to you on that one. See, I was being library-centric. That's the second event was the National Data Summit of 2011. This was an opportunity, the first one in Canada, to bring stakeholders together to talk about research data and its importance in Canada and what we were doing right and what we were doing wrong. And there was about 150, 160 people from federal departments, academia, the private sector that came together to address this. The main thing that came out of that summit was the need to carry on this discussion further. It's that this is the first time the conversation had a forum, and it was clear that there was a lot to talk about, and there needed to be a continuing voice on the topic. So one of the recommendations was the formation of an organization called Research Data Canada, and that was started in 2012. Anything to add there? Okay. Then there's the following year where there's the National Digital Infrastructure Summit. This was CUCIO, our CIO professional organization in Canada. And they have an annual conference, and they organize this summit around the conference. Now, this is also at a time when both Canary and Compute Canada were facing an end of a funding commitment and a renewal of a funding commitment. There was some anxiety around how that was going to happen under that government. And so there was an added motivation at that summit. But what came out of that summit was a group called the Leadership Council on Digital Infrastructure, and that was a organization that was to be the voice for promoting to the government digital infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think that that group today still shares a common interest in pushing this forward. And I think, I'm going to look to Jennifer to nod or shake her head, that really the next step is securing that national support to really drive mandates forward and to push this initiative forward and make some sort of success in developing this national infrastructure.
Okay, thanks. In October of 2013, the Tri-Council, the three Tri-Councils plus CFI and Genomics Canada, and there may have been a couple other funding bodies, held a consultation on capitalizing on big data. And the focus of that was to address the stewardship of research data. And coming out of that was for the council kind of conflicting information or conflicting responses. What really came out of that was that there's clearly a culture difference in the research community around data sharing. Data sharing is not universally accepted by all scientists or by all researchers or by all disciplines. Some disciplines have this whipped. Others haven't even started to address it. And I think that was the big point. It was going to take a lot more work to address the sharing of research data in Canada. But a year later, we have open science identified as a priority by the government. And that open science has a mandate to share, when possible, data collected by, research data collected by federal departments with the public. And so here is a challenge to the culture of not sharing. And I think that's helped shape the challenge for at least our our major academic funding councils, because they have a government policy that says use data management plans and share your data, and they've got a research community where it's divided, and they have to address that. So that's something that's continuing. In January of 2014, there was the second National Digital Infrastructure Summit. This is one that the Leadership Council had helped organize and create the agenda. And for me, what was most significant about this summit was the clear recognition of research data as the third leg of the stool for digital infrastructure. It's not just the research network, it's not just high performance computing, it's also data. It's the three of them together. If you want to add to how about the next one?
Okay. So Compute Canada, as you can see in 2014, not widely publicized, but certainly launched Globus and OwnCloud. Globus was more widely publicized and is really sort of one of the key foundational technology layers to help with the transfer of these data sets from point to point, making sure that the data can be used and analyzed on big systems and provide that initial sort of step forward to provide the technology layer for future research data management needs. And OwnCloud, which is essentially an open source Dropbox, to help address some of those barriers that were preventing data from being shared, allowing more flexibility of sharing of data sets and higher capacity to share large data sets.
Thank you. Also coming out of that National Digital Infrastructure Summit in 2014 was this challenge to demonstrate that Canada, that the stakeholders in Canada around research data actually had some solutions. Could they demonstrate that they could deliver services to researchers? And that was called the Research Data Canada Federated Pilot Series. And that was the context where Compute Canada, along with Carl, launched 2 pilots together. One was with SFU and Compute Canada around creating a software stack that involved ingesting data from Islandora into a preservation pipeline and then depositing it with a repository, Globus publication. The second pilot was to take, and they were only pushed 2 data sets through that, so they wanted to test the robustness of that particular model. So the data from the International Polar Year that had been preserved by the Canadian Polar Data Network in Canada had a larger, more diverse collection of research data, and we set up a configuration that would push that data through the pipeline, and out of that came some lessons, important lessons, where there were bottlenecks, where there were deficiencies, but also it showed that, hey, this could work if we did some modifications and built this software to deal with the limitations. And so that has subsequently fueled the collaboration that was announced at the end of January between Carl Portage and Compute Canada. Anything to add to that?
Put your earmuffs on for a second. So all the stuff leading up to this was all excellent ideas and great incentives and a good willingness to partner and collaborate. But this pilot project, I think, at least from my perspective and my involvement, was the first tangible piece that people said, you know what, we can do something. Yeah. This is possible. This is now feasible. So it's past that sort of theoretical, there's good things we can do, and putting something into practice.
Yeah. And it also was our first stab at doing something concrete around our model that we had developed with the initial CFI proposal. And it allowed us to take components of that and demonstrate that, yes, we can build this. And we have the technology. It's the social attitudes that we have to change. It's So ARC, up to this point, Carl was in a pilot of its own called ARC, and it's not Advanced Research Computing. It was the name of the hotel where they met. So Carl ARC was, and when we got to September of 2014, the library community involved said, this isn't a project anymore, this isn't a pilot, we're doing this, we're making things happen. Let's rename it, create a network, and get moving. And so that was an action item 2 that moved us on. There was an important event that was held by, hosted by Research Data Canada, that was held at the University of Alberta. It was a Vice President's Research Workshop to look at the issue of institutions taking on stewardship responsibilities for their research data. And coming out of that was a very important exercise where a set of principles were identified. And those set of principles it's like a concordant where people sign off and say, yes, we believe in these principles. That final version was just completed. So the workshop was in November. There was a draft that was circulated in January. There were revisions to the draft the end of February. That's now being circulated within the VPR community. And I think that's important because it's a common set of principles around which, just as the set of principles were identified by the Tri-Council, we now have universities saying this is a set of principles by which we observe and behave. And the first one is recognizing research data as a valuable asset. And it takes us back to right at the beginning, we were talking about that first problem, neglect of a valuable asset. This is a statement that recognizing that research data is a valuable asset.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing from a UBC perspective, so Helen Berg, our AVP Research, attended the event, and when she came back, or even before she landed, I think she had emailed Eugene and I with a dozen different documents to review and respond to, and really made clear that research data management is part of the ARC scope and something we need to be aware of and continue to work on. So it secured that support from the UBC Institutional Perspective.
Great. Do you want to take 11?
Oh yes, so Compute Canada in 2015 recently conducted their Spark consultations, and this is really an assessment of the national community on what the research needs are, and that is to help inform and guide future developments. Clearly from UBC, we've seen, in the response to Spark, as well as, institutional surveys, that research data management is top of mind, and not just the data management, but also the technologies that support it. But this Spark consultation will really help inform the development and deployment of the national infrastructure in the coming years. So if you haven't already, by the way, please go to Compute Canada if you have an opinion, have insight, submit this. This will really help form the national platform moving forward.
And just as a footnote from my perspective, what's really important about what's happening right now with Compute Canada is that its funding is coming from CFI. It's really bound in a box. So one of the things that we learned from this last competition for funding was that there are far more requests for use of Compute Canada resources than is possible given the current funding.
Yeah.
And so the box is too small. And so now I think we need Industry Canada to be looking at a way of freeing Compute Canada's resources from that particular source and providing them with a more robust source of funding.
Yes, one of the key challenges for the national platform is not only access to that funding, but to ensure that that funding is sustainable, and exploring more than just the previous CFI funded model, working with Industry Canada, expanding the scope even to help support connections with industry and outcomes, and clinical outcomes and industry outcomes as well.
And then the 12th point is that MOU that was announced at the end of January, where we're working together on a 2-year project to build a production version of what we had a pilot over the past year. 2015. So I had mentioned that there are many stakeholders involved. This is a representation of what the research data ecosystem should look like from the perspective of an EU work group called the Global Research Data Infrastructure 2020. It was part of the Horizon 2020 funding. What I think is interesting about this is that they show views of the ecosystem, and the ecosystem is made up of institutions. And depending upon what research problem you're working on, you'll have different groupings of the institutions that are involved in this. So that means, again, you have to have relationships established between the stakeholders within the ecosystem to operate. It was fascinating being in that workshop because the problems that were being addressed were what we call the big science challenges, climate change, response to natural disasters, whether there was earthquakes or floods, migration, massive migration. And they were saying that these have to be, first of all, the data sources can't be bound nationally because the science problem is international. And so you have we have to work with institutions that will allow that. And they were saying that it's interdisciplinary. We need the data sources from many disciplines to actually understand these problems. So this is a Canadian picture of some of our stakeholders. This isn't a comprehensive set of the stakeholders, but it's an interesting graph. It's one that Dugan has used before. And it's broken up the digital research ecosystem into 4 functional areas: use, direction, support, and services. And you'll notice that the services, there's those 3 legs of infrastructure that I talked about earlier: Compute Canada, Canary, and Portage for data. You notice the list of support, the funders that are identified. Use, I added society there because I think we need to be considering society's use of research data as well. But society isn't just the users. We've got citizen scientists who are contributing data. So you've already been in bloom season. We won't be there for another 6 weeks. But we have a group of botanists, amateur botanists, who record online when the species and when that first bloom is. And we can start tracking now over the years how the dates are getting earlier and earlier for when plants are blooming in Edmonton. Then there's the direction. Where are we getting direction? Identifies Industry Canada, the Leadership Council we've mentioned, in Research Data Canada. You want to add anything to that? This is a set of acronyms that may not be very informative, but it's the diversity of the organizations that are represented by those acronyms that I want to emphasize. And these are organizations with whom I've had conversations between September and December of this past year. An example of MEOPAR, that's a center of excellence dealing with the ocean research community. Fascinating challenges that they face around research data. I participated in the Ocean Data Management Expert Forum in November, where they were bringing communities, cross-sector communities too. There was federal departments, there were provincial departments, there were regional departments, there were researchers from universities, and looking at the diversity of data that they collect and how they can't share it with one another. They don't have the infrastructure to facilitate that sharing, and how they're going to address that. There's the Canadian Association of Research Ethics Boards. We're working with them now around data management plans and how data management plans can help make ethics applications better, how it can improve research ethics applications. There's CARE, the Canadian Association of Research Administrators, working with them because there are units on campus that all touch on aspects of research, but we aren't necessarily well coordinated with one another, and data can help coordinate us better. And then there's one that may not be familiar to you is CASRA. That's a standards body. It's and looking at standards for research administrative information. It's a way of doing a better integration of across administrative systems, of sharing metadata. For me, the four most important organizations for research data are our 4 regional library consortia. Each of those represent for me the platform upon which services can be provided to institutions. Now, granted, there are significant institutions within each of these regional consortia that help sustain the regions in operating, but it's this organizational structure that allows. It's not unlike the organizational structure from Compute Canada, which has WestGrid and its other regional partners. It's not unlike Canary, which has its networks, BCNet, and its partners across the country. There's never been one organized for research data until now with Portage, and it's built around our regional library consortia. Do you want to say, this is Steve's first shot at these slides, so he's doing great.
You're seeing them the first time I'm seeing them as well. So, traditional Compute Canada storage services. Just looking at this here, so there's, I think what Dugan wanted to say is there's lots of data services that already exist within Compute Canada, but how you access it is very limited. So it's, very basic level type interface, command line interface. Yeah. There's not a fancy GUI click and drag type of layer that sits in front of it. So to really do anything significant to a broad user base, and to help enable that to happen, there definitely needs to be tool sets built on top of those storage platforms. And in order to, this is Globus.
Yeah.
So in order to help facilitate that ease of use, Globus was one of those services that I mentioned earlier to help with that easier transition of those large data sets across the country. This is the sign-in screen for it. As far as use cases across the country, so there's a number of different data platforms that have been developed. There's a few different competitions that help support these. Compute Canada has its own research platforms and portals competition, I think it's called. CFI has the cyber infrastructure competition. And some of these groups, the GenApp work, which the UBC ARC team has been actively investigating and providing access to. And there's some other examples here of these research portals that have been developed using these different funding models and the partnerships that have been developed with Portage and Carl and other groups in Compute Canada. So I'm reading these slides as I describe them. Compute Canada started with the self-service research data management model, which meant here's a bunch of tools and technologies, have at her. There really wasn't a whole lot of support or expertise to help advise how to best use those tools. There was, the basic tools and services introduced to lower the barrier, so those things like Globus and OwnCloud to help with ease of access to these different technologies. And we saw the slide where these communities have come together to develop these portals that are using these technologies in order to provide an easier interface to get access to that data or provide discovery of those data sets. There's definitely work across Compute Canada, not just within research data management, but to build a suite of common services that can be used by all portals and all systems. So providing a little more consistency with workflows, again, to help enable that access to happen. And the research data management project with Carl, as we've been describing all day, is an important component of all of these future services and is really an example of how libraries and IT providers need to work together amongst other stakeholders to really help move this forward.
So that has to be a testimony, because he'd never seen that slide before. That's testimony. It has to be true. So we really have 3 goals within Portage, and it's around that shared stewardship of research data that I mentioned earlier. and that is we need to help develop a national research data culture. I mentioned that culture remains very split around data sharing at this stage. But we also need, as we work on the data culture, to also foster a community of practice for research data, and to work on building some of the national data services and infrastructure. So we have started with a network of expertise. The first network of expertise was around data management planning. Eugene Barsky, who was a member of that team that put together a national template for data stewardship. And then Eugene has also implemented a UBC template for research data management that is accessible through that tool with the UBC visible display or presentation. We've also started a expert group around data discovery. This is something that is very critical. We talk about data reuse, but if it's data that's in all these different repositories where you'd have to go to all the repositories to do the discovery of what's available, it's just not going to work. And so we're looking at, well, what's a federated discovery tool going to look like? This is very important to this eventual success of research data management in Canada. And so this team is working on the problem. They're starting with preparing a white paper of what's happening internationally. But we also, Eugene's on this committee, and UBC has a very valuable discovery platform, a federated discovery platform that can well inform how we might approach research data management in this area. I'm really pleased that UBC can make a contribution to data discovery through its expertise in federated searches. We also have started a skills and training expert group. They're working initially on online training, so providing online courses. They're looking at the product called Mantra that was developed at the University of Edinburgh and seeing if they can Canadianize that product, as well as look at other, say a MOOC or other delivery of training for research data management. We have a data preservation team that's working with Compute Canada on the project that we'll be mentioning shortly. We'll also have forthcoming an ethics and data working group, and also we're looking at working with Library and Archives Canada around a peer certification of data repositories. Someone can now just hang out their shingle and say, I'm a data repository. The question is, well, can you trust it? And so we're looking at a peer evaluation process. Currently, internationally, there's a self-evaluated process called the Data Seal of Approval, which is developed in the Netherlands. At the other extreme, you can pay big bucks to an organization that will come in and evaluate you and certify you as trusted. We're looking for that middle ground where the community supports one another, does the assessment, and gives us ratings. So there'll be other expert groups coming along as we work this. I'm making the transition to the platforms of service that we'll be providing. And really this model represents the cloud. We certainly aren't going to be doing infrastructure as a service. That's Compute Canada and Canary's role. But we're looking at platforms of service where we actually build software stacks that work together, and as well as software as a service, such as the data management planning tool. And this is a slide shot of the Portage data management planning tool. This is a topic that has a lot of international interest right now. At the conference last week, I was very excited to see the US team that developed the DMP tool out of the California Digital Library talking to the Digital Curation Center people in the UK with their DMP Online, which this is based on. They're going to merge the code base into one. And they're going to work collaboratively around this. So we're positioned well. Canada is the first to provide a DMP online service that is multilingual. And we have that to thank our colleagues at the University of Montreal and helping us, and the coders at the University of Alberta to develop this. So it put Canada out on front at this conference because of that initiative. There was an institution in Germany that took that fork off of GitHub and took all the language tables and converted them to German. Now there's a German version running as well, so you can have I don't know if they're running the French as well as the English, but probably not, just the German. This is an example of a web service that I'm seeking funding for in partnership. This is a format policy registry. This is a registry of the variety of research formats that exist. And when you do the normalization exercise in preserving data, you look and say, is this a format that gives us a reliable future for this product? And if it isn't, what is the reliable future today? What is the reliable format for the future today? And you do a conversion, a migration to that format. And this is going to be a very important web service because it'll not only support repositories in their preservation purpose, but it also can inform other tools. So a researcher preparing a data management plan might say, what is the preservation format for GIS today? And so, as I look at how I'm going to prepare my data for deposit at the end of my research project, this is the format that I should be looking to deposit. So this is a tool that I think there isn't one internationally, a service like this yet. When it comes to developing infrastructure, and this is a set of points that come from Cameron Nayland around the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. He says there are three leading principles: governance, sustainability, and insurance. And by insurance, what he's really talking about is succession planning. That if your service ends, your infrastructure terminates, who's going to ensure that it carries on? Who's going to pick it up? And it's sustainability clearly is the funding, and the governance is how the infrastructure runs. So those are things that we're working on with Portage. And so here's our next steps. One is that we now have approval for a governance structure, and we are now assembling a steering committee, and we hope to have this group together by March 21st, and we have our first steering committee planned for April 25th. We are launching our Portage website. Now I was told in the message this morning that it's the middle of March. So as long as it doesn't slip beyond that, because it used to be the middle of February, and now it's the middle of March. We'll be adding additional expert groups, looking for additional partners in national platform services. And then this takes us to our collaboration. But maybe now's a good time to stop just to have some discussion around what we've covered, because we've covered a lot of territory, and Steve's been outstanding.
I always take compliments if anyone wants to stand up and give them. Thank you.
I don't know that this is as important as now addressing any of the issues that you might have from what's been described or concerns that you have around research data management. And if there isn't any, I'm going to push on, but I do want to take this moment. Yes, thank you, in the back.
My name is Kevin, I'm a science librarian, and I follow as best I can developments in data. What I'm seeing is a lot of it is the publishers or the societies, American Geophysical Union, American Chemical Society, are recommending or suggesting the use of already existing data repositories. So what role do you play, or do we play, in terms of developing a new digital repository or data repository when the publisher is already recommending repositories that already exist? It seems like we're in some ways coming a little bit late to the game.
So here's my first concern about publisher repositories, is that like our articles, we will have given them our articles and our copyright, and then we'll have to pay them to get access. My concern with publishers running data repositories is that our researchers will give them their data and then charge us for access to them. And I don't think that's a sustainable future for us. We're looking at just what the US dollar has done to imbalance what we have to pay for our subscription services. Whenever the Canadian dollar drops as much as it does now, we're always having to look at cutting subscriptions. We're always reducing access to information. We can't afford that with data either. So that's my first concern. The second matter is, it goes back to those three principles that Cameron had laid out around governance and insurance and sustainability. I think that publishers' repositories should tell us what's their governance model, what's their sustainability model, and what's their insurance. If they go down, what's going to happen to all the data? So I think there's criteria that we can provide publisher repositories to provide confidence that using them is a practice that will ensure the long-term stewardship of the data. If we can ensure that, I don't have any objection to having commercial data repositories part of the research community. Where my concern is that long-term stewardship and whether it's affordable in the long run for us to have access. So it may be that our business model for integrated data repository support in Canada will involve some kind of fee, as long as that fee isn't prohibited and down. So if they participate in a business model that fits with the rest of Canadian data repositories, that's fine.
I would say, I mean, assuming that let's say UBC researchers are 100% compliant with NSERC or CHR, funding requirements, all that information will be available to the public anyway. I mean, so the cost of the journal subscriptions won't affect the general public because our researchers will be in compliance with the Tri-Council open access requirements. No, and it's not just, I mean, there's other data services like Figshare, Pangea, UCAR, NCAR in Colorado has a big data site for data, climatic data. So it's not just the publishers, but also other organizations.
And you've identified three different business models too with those three organizations. That's why I say I think that information is critical to have for the researcher when they're making a decision where they're going to deposit their data. There was another point that I wanted to make about this long-term access. One of the things that we're witnessing right now in the publishing industry is that we have fewer and fewer publishers. It's a concentration. If you look at the concentration index in publishing, well, we have three big ones now. That's what we're down to. So that counters the possibility of this open sharing of data by publishers. When there's fewer competing with one, they bought Elsevier bought out Figshare, for example. Figshare had a very strong presence at the conference I was at last week. They were giving away T-shirts. That shows you how much money they have. Eugene.
So Chuck, research data is a very big adventure for us, and I personally see it as if to be successful, we have to work as a triangle of partners on campuses, the IT folks, the VP research folks, or Office of Research Services, and the library. We actually work very hard in UBC to establish this triangle, and we have it existing now, but can you please refer to it, if you see it's the same way as a partnership for a successful work in research data?
So we're working at different levels. We're working at the level of the institution and the role the institution has. There's a level below that. There's the project level where the researcher's working. Now, and then on top of that, there is this regional and national role and the organizations that represent the professionals at the institution level. And so the more we can have our professional associations that hold the membership of those members of our community working together, providing the norms and the culture that works at an institutional level. I think the stronger the connections will become at the institutional level. If you have an excellent working model now between your departments, you're way ahead of a lot of institutions. And I think one of the projects that the Digital Curation Center at the UK instituted was to actually go to campuses at their invitation and to host collaborations with representatives from the different service units for research on their campus, to get them to talk to one another, to talk about data, where they're related to data, getting them to work together. So if you've already solved that problem, you can run the workshop that's run for those institutions that are still challenged by this. If it's a case where the coordination happening at your institution means that the data will be better prepared for use, a deposit in a repository. And it's going to be more comprehensive in terms of the description, the context of the data, and I think the product is not only going to be more comprehensive, more complete. You're going to have a richer collection as a result. So I'm a strong advocate of institutions with the service units around research getting together to identify their common roles around research data and how they can work better together. Here's another reason, and that is one of the things that we don't want to do through research data management is increase the administrative burden on researchers. In the US, there's a frequently cited poll where 40% of a researcher's time is spent on administrative details. That's a lot of time that's spent doing administration rather than research. And so one of the things that if we can get those units working together, we may be able to develop better tools to reduce the burden on administrative burden on our researchers. We want them to enter information once and reuse it many times. We don't want them to be entering it multiple times across different platforms.
Well, I have a question.
Why don't you just make a statement?
I don't want to state anything, I want to ask. This one is more of to get your feedback on your observations. So you mentioned earlier that there's certain domains that have some maturity in the research data management space as far as managing their own data. Can you give any insight into which of those domains have that sort of maturity, those that are emerging areas and those that may be a far way off, just to get an assessment of what we might as an institution be prepared for as far as research data management needs around campus.
So if your discipline is dependent on the shared, on a large shared instrument, like the Large Hadron Collider, Triumph, the seabed observation. If you're in a discipline that's dependent on those, you're in a discipline that shares data. It's the necessity of the way the data are collected that forces that community to share their data. If you're in a discipline where you have your own data center, it means that there's that massive amounts of data being collected. You're already in a discipline where you need to share data. So the astronomy, the physicists, the ocean researchers, those are disciplines where there is a tradition of data sharing. I'm going to describe another discipline that is bipolar. It's a discipline where you find a lot of sharing, no sharing. Humanities. I'm continually being confronted where I go by humanities researchers who say, this just doesn't apply to me. And I'll say, well, what do you do to organize your digital materials for research. And they'll describe what it is, but I don't need research data management to help. On the other end is digital humanities. Digital humanities has already introduced data management planning with their community. They're already into data sharing. So they're taking what are called observatories of the web, where they take the web and look for a particular snapshot of it. They take that in, they use that as data, and they share it. So there's a community that is really divided in terms of its current stance on the relevance of data sharing and the relevance of data management planning. And then I think there's another of other fields where it's just divided. And the divide isn't really kind of 50-50. It's kind of like 60% are just perplexed by, why are we talking about this? And then there's about 18% that are hostile, and then the balance which are pro-data sharing. And that comes from surveys that have been conducted, that roughly that figure. So that applies to a number of other disciplines.
Thank you.
Yes?
I was just wondering where healthcare data fits into on that spectrum.
I'm seeing some amazing changes in health research right now. I never thought I'd see the day that clinical research or clinical trial research would be leading how the need to share clinical trial results. I never thought I'd see that day. Right now, there's a very strong movement, not just in the UK, but it's spreading internationally. And so it's the challenge is, well, you know, how do we use technology to still honor ethics, ethical commitments to the participants in the research? And but I saw a researcher last year address the Research Data Alliance Assembly. It was the day after the Apple Watch had been announced. And embedded in the Apple Watch was a research data platform that Apple is supporting that would allow researchers to use the sensors on the watch to capture biological measures. And this doctor was part of a trial with that, a clinical researcher, and then he was talking about how that's going to change the way he does clinical research. He said, I spend maybe a year to 2 years trying to find patients through patient records who would fit my particular trial. He said, no, it doesn't matter. I have 60,000 people signing up, and the data will tell me whether they've got the condition or not. But what's more important for him is that he gets a continuous monitoring of this. He doesn't just see the patient's record data maybe twice a year or once a year. He gets continuous monitoring, and he's talking now about understanding the cycle of a disease. And I have a rheumatoid arthritis. I know exactly what he's talking about, the cycle of a disease. And so he's very excited. Now that creates new challenges around consent. And how do you do continuous consent? How do you manage that? So we're on a new frontier that technology is leading us, where suddenly health research is some of the most exciting research around research data management. Well, thank you. Oh, yes.
Back to one of your earlier slides, and a question about sort of more governance and leadership. I'm in the office of the VPRI here, but recently came from a funding agency, and still get a little twitchy when I see it described as a problem that funding agencies are looking for greater accountability and ROI. So we'd just like to hear you both comment on the role of your respective organizations in assuming that's a problem, and I'm not sure it is. Just addressing that, what your responsibilities are in addressing.
From my perspective, it's providing the research councils with the services that will allow our researchers to meet the expectation of the funding agencies. So if what the research councils are after is the deposit of the data from their study and intelligent access to the data, then Portage is committed to establishing the infrastructure that will support that. So it's a very operational, functional response to it there. Now, does this make the research more accountable? I think that falls back to the discipline in which the research is being conducted. I mean, that's the peer process. To me, the peer review process is where a lot of accountability, or those who want to reproduce results of research claims. Again, that comes back to the colleagues of the professionals the researchers who've published. So I don't see, Portage isn't going to replace peer review. But maybe what we can do is we can support peer review by providing access to data management plans with the consent of the researcher to include reviewers at that stage. And we can facilitate the access to the data from the publications to allow other professionals to reproduce results.
And from a UBC ARC perspective, I won't necessarily speak to Compute Canada because I'm sure they have an opinion that they would want me to speak on their behalf. But from UBC ARC, we're really trying to enable research excellence to happen. So rather than provide that accountability, provide the best environment possible for our researchers to be as competitive and successful as possible. And if that means, providing the infrastructure and supports for the access and capacity to use these technical resources that are in compliance, or the preferred compliance with granting agencies and other funding agencies' expectations, then that's why we're here, to enable this research to happen, and to happen in a way that's attractive to the funding agencies to secure those research dollars, and accelerate the time to discovery. So, quicker time to publication, quicker time to make new discoveries, to access new data sets, et cetera. Does that answer your question? Thanks.
That's a good answer.
Hey. Don't ask anymore.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the attention that you've given, and I appreciate the turnout. This is a wonderful turnout. I encourage you to speak to your library about research data management, what they're involved in. This is just a start for them. They've been working in this area. It's not that it's a brand new start, but it's the starting point for this next step, which is a national participation, national role. Thank you.